I followed my husband to the bank one Tuesday, and that single decision unraveled 40 years of marriage in less than 10 minutes. Hello, my name is Linda Carver, and I am 67 years old. I've been a wife longer than I've been anything else, and until recently, I believed I knew the man I married. I was wrong. Painfully, humiliatingly wrong. If you're here for a neat story with a clear villain and a clean ending, I'm sorry in advance. Real betrayal doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, on a predictable schedule, wearing the face you trust most. It started with Tuesdays. For decades, every Tuesday morning, my husband Robert put on the same navy jacket, checked his watch, kissed my cheek, and said, "Bank run. Back in an hour." He never forgot. Not once. Not when he had the flu. Not when our son broke his arm. Not even when I was recovering from surgery and asked him to stay home. At first, I thought it was admirable, responsible, reliable. Then, last winter, something shifted. I asked casually one Tuesday, "Why don't you just do online banking like everyone else?" He froze, not metaphorically, physically. His hand paused mid-button. His eyes didn't meet mine, and in that frozen second, a chill ran through me so sharp I actually rubbed my arms. "I like routine," he said finally, too quickly. "At my age, habits keep you sharp." He smiled after, but it didn't reach his eyes. I told myself I was imagining things. Women my age are told that a lot. You're sensitive. You're bored. You're looking for drama. I swallowed the feeling and went back to folding laundry, but something inside me had already woken up. After that, I noticed everything. How he showered immediately after coming home on Tuesdays. How he never let me balance the checkbook anymore. How our savings never seemed to grow, but never dipped enough to raise alarms. And how defensive he became if I asked even the smallest question. One Tuesday I said, half joking, "You know, if you're secretly running a second family, now's the time to confess." He laughed. Too loudly. "You watch too much television, Linda," he said, turning away from me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, counting rotations like I used to count contractions when giving birth. My instincts, the ones I'd ignored for years in favor of peace, were screaming. So the next Tuesday, I followed him. I waited 10 minutes after he left, then grabbed my coat and keys, my heart thudding like I was doing something illegal. I felt ridiculous, a 67-year-old woman playing detective on her own husband, but embarrassment is easier to live with than regret. I parked across the street from the bank and watched. Robert didn't go inside. He stood near the ATM vestibule, checking his watch, scanning the sidewalk, and then she appeared. A woman about my age, well-dressed, careful makeup, familiar posture, the posture of someone who's learned how to take up as little space as possible. She smiled when she saw him. He smiled back. That was worse than any kiss. They didn't touch. They didn't embrace. They stood close, shoulders angled toward each other, speaking quietly, intimately, like people who didn't need to fill silence. Then he handed her an envelope. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit on them. She took it, nodded, said something that made his shoulders sag, and then, God help me, he reached out and brushed something from her sleeve with his thumb. A small, familiar gesture, one I'd seen 1,000 times directed at me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there, frozen, watching 40 years reassemble themselves into a shape I didn't recognize. When they parted, she walked away down the street. Robert went into the bank alone, like nothing had happened. I drove home on autopilot, my mind racing through possibilities. Mistress, blackmail, secret child. I wanted it to be something simple, something I could hate cleanly. That night at dinner, I watched him chew, watched his hands, watched the man who knew my body, my fears, my habits. Did everything go okay at the bank? I asked softly. Yes, he said, same as always. I nodded, smiled, passed the salt. but inside something had hardened. Because whatever that envelope was, whatever that woman meant to him, it was something he chose every Tuesday over me. And I was done being the woman who didn't ask why. By Wednesday morning, I knew one thing for certain. If I confronted Robert too soon, I'd never get the truth. 40 years teaches you how your spouse lies, not the obvious kind, the subtle kind, the sigh before an answer, the way a sentence gets padded with unnecessary detail. Robert was good at that. Careful, controlled. If I asked him directly about Tuesday, he'd smooth it over, tell me I was imagining things, and I'd walk away doubting myself instead of him. So I stayed quiet. I made his coffee the way I always did, 2 sugars, splash of milk. I listened to him complain about the news, about his knee, about how prices weren't what they used to be. I nodded and underscored entirely the right places. I even laughed when he made a joke I'd heard 100 times. But inside I was cataloging. That afternoon I pulled out our old files, the ones in the back of the hall closet that hadn't been touched in years. Insurance papers, deeds, statements. My hands trembled as I sorted through them, the dust making my nose itch. Everything looked normal at first, too normal. Then I noticed something small. A withdrawal slip, not recent, years old. Same amount, same date, Tuesday. I sat down on the floor, the paper shaking in my hands. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Another slip, then another. Always Tuesdays, always cash. Not enormous sums, just enough to stay under notice, just enough to never raise suspicion. I felt sick. This wasn't an affair fueled by passion or recklessness. This was deliberate, long-term, planned. That night, I pretended to fall asleep early. I waited until I felt the mattress dip as Robert climbed into bed, waited until his breathing evened out. Then I quietly slipped out, heart pounding like I was 16 again, and sneaking out after curfew. His jacket was hanging on the chair. I checked the pockets. Receipts, a pen, mints, and then, tucked into the inner pocket, a folded piece of paper. An address. Not a hotel, not a restaurant. A residential address, handwritten, worn soft at the creases, like it had been unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, staring at it, my chest tight. This wasn't new. This was history. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next Tuesday, I followed him again. This time, I didn't stop at the bank. I waited until he handed her the envelope, waited until they exchanged those quiet words, that intimate silence. Then I followed her. She walked 3 blocks, turned down a side street, and unlocked the door to a small, aging house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. She paused before going inside, pressing her palm flat against the door like she was steadying herself. I parked across the street and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Something about the place made my stomach twist. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't secretive in a scandalous way. It was sad. An hour later, she came out carrying a grocery bag. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about desire. This was about responsibility. The realization landed slowly, heavily, like a truth that didn't want to be known. Robert wasn't sneaking off for pleasure. He was supporting someone. And suddenly, the possibilities rearranged themselves into something far more devastating than an affair. I waited until Thursday. At dinner, I said calmly, "Do you remember Carol Whitman?" His fork froze halfway to his mouth. Carol Whitman, his first wife. Married young, divorced before I ever met him. A name he rarely spoke, tucked away like an old mistake. "Why would you ask that?" he said too evenly. "She's alive, isn't she?" I asked. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. "Yes," he said finally, "she is." My heart sank. "And you see her every Tuesday." He closed his eyes. That single gesture told me everything. "She's sick," he said quietly. "She has no one else." And for 40 years, I whispered, you chose to carry that alone. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw fear, not of being caught, but of being judged. You wouldn't have understood, he said. That hurt more than the lie. Because he was wrong. What I didn't understand yet, what he still hadn't told me, was the full cost of those Tuesdays. And when I finally learned the truth, it would change not just how I saw my husband, but how I saw myself. I didn't tell Robert I was going to see her. That part still surprises me, because I've always been the kind of woman who announces her intentions, who believes in fairness and face-to-face honesty. But after 40 years of being quietly managed, quietly protected, quietly excluded, I wanted one thing that was just mine. The truth, unfiltered. So the following Monday, while Robert was in the shower, I took the address from my purse, put on my coat, and left the house without a word. My hands shook the entire drive, not from fear exactly, from anticipation. Like my body already knew this meeting would split my life into before and after. The house looked smaller in daylight, more tired. The porch sagged in the middle. Wind chimes clinked softly, one of them cracked. I sat in my car for a full minute, watching the front door, thinking absurdly about whether I should bring flowers. As if this were a social call, I knocked. It took a while, then footsteps. The door opened just enough for a face to appear. She recognized me immediately. Her eyes widened, not in shock, but in something closer to resignation, like she'd been expecting this moment for years. "You're Linda," she said. I nodded. "You're Carol." She opened the door fully and stepped back. "You might as well come in." The living room was neat but sparse. Old furniture, family photos, none of Robert, I noticed, and the faint smell of menthol and lemon cleaner. She moved carefully, favoring one leg. "I don't have much time," she said, settling into a chair. I get tired easily. I sat across from her, my heart hammering. "How long?" She smiled sadly. "Since before you married him." That landed like a punch. "He never stopped helping me," she continued. "Not after the divorce, not after you, not even after I told him he didn't owe me anything." "Why?" I asked. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. She hesitated, then looked straight at me. "Because of our son." The room tilted. "Our? What?" "Daniel," she said softly. "He's 41 now." I laughed once, sharp and involuntary. "That's impossible." She didn't flinch. "He was born 6 months before your wedding." The math was brutal, precise, unforgiving. I stood up, my legs unsteady. "Robert told me you had no children." "He told you what he needed to," she replied gently. I wanted to scream, to demand proof, to accuse her of lying. Instead, I asked, "Where is he?" Carol looked away, her fingers twisted in her lap. "He doesn't know Robert is his father." My stomach dropped. "He doesn't know." "He thinks his father abandoned us," she said quietly, "and in every way that mattered, he did." The room felt too small to hold all of this. "Then what have the Tuesdays been for?" I whispered. Carol swallowed. "Daniel is sick. Kidney failure. He's been on the transplant list for years. Robert has been helping with treatment costs." Quietly, "He didn't want Daniel to know." "And you let him." I snapped, anger finally breaking through. She looked up at me, eyes wet. I didn't have a choice. I stared at her, at the tired furniture, at the life stitched together with secrecy and cash-filled envelopes. 40 years. 40 years of Tuesdays. I left without saying goodbye. The drive home blurred. When I pulled into my driveway, Robert was already there, standing on the porch, waiting. "You went to see her," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I did." He looked older in that moment than I'd ever seen him. Smaller, like the weight he'd been carrying had finally bent his spine. "She told you," he said. "She told me everything," I said, "except one thing." He met my eyes. "What's that?" why you thought lying to me was kindness." He didn't answer. He just lowered his head. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the end of the secret. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. I didn't speak to Robert for 2 days after that. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. If I'd opened my mouth too soon, everything would have come out wrong. The anger mixed with grief, the love tangled up with humiliation. I needed to hear my own thoughts before I heard his excuses. Those 2 days felt longer than some entire years of my marriage. Robert slept on the couch without being asked. I heard him moving at night, restless, clearing his throat like he wanted to say something and didn't know how. He made coffee in the mornings and left my mug untouched on the counter, like an offering I refused to accept. On the 3rd evening, I finally sat across from him at the kitchen table. He looked at me the way people look at doctors before bad news, braced, afraid, hopeful anyway. "Talk," I said. So he did. He told me about Carol getting pregnant during what he called a stupid, selfish overlap. He told me he chose me because I was stable and good, words that stung more than if he'd said nothing at all. He told me he paid child support at first, quietly, until Carol remarried and asked him to disappear so Daniel could grow up normal. "I thought that was the right thing," he said, voice cracking. "Staying away." "And the last 40 years?" I asked. He swallowed. I watched from a distance. Birthdays, hospitalizations, college tuition he never finished because he got sick. I couldn't be his father, but I could make sure he didn't suffer. "And I was never part of that decision," I said. "No," he whispered. "You weren't." That word, weren't, rang in my ears. "You robbed me of the choice," I said. "You let me believe my life was honest when it wasn't." He nodded, tears sliding down his face. "I was afraid you'd leave." I leaned back in my chair, exhausted. "So you chose a lie that lasted 40 years instead." The next weeks passed in a strange limbo. We moved around each other like roommates after a bad argument. Polite, distant, careful. I found myself replaying every memory every Tuesday, every unexplained mood, rewriting my own history with this new information layered on top. And then the phone rang. Robert answered. I watched his face change as he listened, the color draining, the hand gripping the counter. When he hung up, he looked at me. "It's Daniel." My chest tightened despite myself. "What about him?" "He's been moved to the top of the transplant list," Robert said. "They found a donor match." I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something darker rise up, a question I didn't want to ask, but did anyway. "You've been tested, haven't you?" He didn't answer. "You have," I said. "Haven't you?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Years ago." "And?" I pressed. "I'm compatible." The room went silent. "You were going to give him your kidney," I said. "Yes," without telling me. He reached for my hand. I pulled it back. "Do you understand?" I said slowly, carefully, "that this isn't just about betrayal anymore?" He nodded, but I don't think he truly did. Because here was the truth I hadn't said out loud yet, the one growing heavier in my chest with every breath. His secret wasn't just emotional. It was going to change the rest of my life. And I was the only one who hadn't been asked if I was willing to pay the price. The night after Robert told me about the kidney, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there listening to his breathing from the couch, slow and uneven, like even his body didn't know where it belonged anymore. I stared at the dark and realized something uncomfortable about myself. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at the version of me who had been so accommodating for so long. 40 years of being understanding. 40 years of not asking too many questions. 40 years of believing love meant endurance. By morning, something in me had shifted. At breakfast, Robert stood in the doorway like a man waiting for a verdict. I buttered my toast slowly, deliberately, the scrape of the knife loud in the quiet kitchen. "When were you planning to tell me about the surgery?" I asked. He cleared his throat. "After the holidays. I didn't want to upset you." I laughed softly. "You didn't want to involve me." "That's not fair," he said too quickly. "Isn't it?" I looked up at him. "You've made every major decision about your guilt without me for 40 years. Why stop now?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "They need a final consent," he said after a moment, "from immediate family." My stomach tightened. "And I'm immediate family." Yes. There it was, the quiet expectation. The assumption that I would nod, swallow my feelings, and stand beside him while he played savior to a life I wasn't allowed to acknowledge. "I'm not signing anything," I said. He stared at me. "Linda." "I'm not stopping you," I continued, "but I'm not blessing it either." His face crumpled. "He's my son." "And I'm your wife," I said, or at least I thought I was. The words landed harder than I intended. He sank into the chair across from me, suddenly looking very old. "You don't understand," he said. "If I don't do this—" "If you do," I interrupted, "you could die, or live the rest of your life limited, weakened, and I would be the one taking care of you." Again, without ever being asked. Silence stretched between us. Finally he whispered, "What do you want me to do?" That question changed everything, because for the first time he wasn't deciding, he was asking. "I want the truth," I said. "All of it. No more protecting me from reality. No more secret Tuesdays. No more martyrdom behind my back." He nodded slowly. "And I want to meet him," I added. His head snapped up. "Linda." "I want to look at the man whose existence shaped our marriage without my consent," I said. "I want to decide for myself how I feel." We met Daniel 2 days later. He was thinner than I expected, pale, polite. He shook my hand carefully, like he didn't trust his strength. When he smiled, I saw Robert's mouth, that familiar curve. My chest tightened despite myself. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. "I know this must be strange." Strange didn't begin to cover it. I watched Robert hover, unsure of his role, desperate to help but afraid to overstep. I saw, for the first time, the cost of his silence, not just to me, to everyone. When Daniel excused himself to the restroom, I turned to Robert. "He doesn't know, does he?" I asked. "No," Robert said, "not yet." I studied my husband's face, the man I had loved through boredom, illness, disappointment, and routine, and I realized something that felt like power settling into my bones. This story was no longer his alone. "Then you'll tell him," I said, "before any surgery, before any more sacrifice." Robert hesitated, then nodded, because this time I wasn't the silent partner. And whatever came next, forgiveness, separation, or something messier, it would be decided with my eyes open. The day Robert told Daniel the truth, I didn't sit beside him. That was deliberate. I sat slightly back, hands folded in my lap, close enough to hear every word, but far enough that this moment couldn't be mistaken for something I was orchestrating or approving. This was his reckoning, not my performance. Daniel listened in silence. No interruption, no dramatics, just stillness. His face barely changed as Robert spoke, about Carol, about the overlap, about the money, about the Tuesdays, about the kidney, about the fear that telling him would do more harm than good. When Robert finally said, "I'm your father," his voice broke in a way I'd never heard before. Daniel didn't cry. He didn't shout. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "So that's why my mother never let me hate you." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. "You let me believe I was abandoned," Daniel continued, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. "You let me build my life around that." "I thought staying away was better," Robert whispered. "For who?" Daniel asked. Not why. For who? That question felt like it cut through all three of us. Daniel stood up carefully, one hand gripping the edge of the table. I need time, he said. Not money, not organs, time. He looked at me then, really looked. And you, he said gently, didn't know, did you? No, I replied. I didn't. He nodded once, like that confirmed something important. Then I'm sorry you were lied to. That small acknowledgement, so simple, so human, did something Robert's apologies hadn't. It eased a tightness in my chest I hadn't realized was there. After he left, Robert collapsed into the chair, covering his face with his hands. I ruined everything, he said. No, I said quietly. You delayed it. That's not the same thing. The weeks that followed were strange. Daniel stopped answering Robert's calls. Carol called once to apologize, I think, but I let it go to voicemail. Robert's surgery was postponed indefinitely. The house felt quieter, but not empty. More like honest. One afternoon, while Robert was out, I went into the study and opened the old desk drawer he'd always kept locked. This time, the key was right there. Inside were envelopes, ledgers, notes, a lifetime of careful accounting, but beneath them was something else. A second bank account, not just withdrawals, savings. My name wasn't on it, but neither was Carol's. The beneficiary listed was Daniel, and the amount, it was far more than I expected. Enough to explain the stalled vacations, the postponed renovations, the way Robert always said, maybe next year. I sat there for a long time, staring at the number. This wasn't just guilt. This was preparation. He had been planning for a future that didn't include me fully informed or fully included. That night, when Robert came home, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I slid the bank statement across the table. Explain this, I said. He went pale. That money, he began, was built during our marriage, I finished. During our life. Yes, he said, but it wasn't taken from you. I stood up, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. You don't get to decide that. That was the moment I understood something essential. This story wasn't about another woman. It wasn't even about another child. It was about agency. And for 40 years, mine had been quietly set aside. What I did next would decide whether I reclaimed it or walked away from everything I'd helped build. I didn't leave that night. I know that's what everyone expects, the dramatic exit, the suitcase, the door closing for good. But real endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet decisions made after the yelling is done and the truth is finally laid bare. I slept in my own bed, alone. Robert stayed on the couch without being told. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the bank statement spread in front of me like a map of every road not taken. The money wasn't just numbers. It was years, deferred dreams, all the laters that never came. When Robert finally came in, his shoulders slumped, eyes red. I didn't let him speak right away. I'm not divorcing you, I said. He looked up, startled. Relief flashed across his face too quickly, and I held up my hand. Don't misunderstand me, I continued. This isn't forgiveness. This is a reckoning. He swallowed hard. What do you want, Linda? For 40 years, I'd never been asked that question honestly. I want control, I said. Not over you, over myself. I slid a folder across the table. Denise's card was clipped to the front. We're restructuring everything, I said. Joint accounts, transparent records, legal acknowledgement of what's mine and what's yours. No hidden funds, no private savior fantasies. He nodded slowly. And Daniel? That's between you and him, I said, but not at my expense. Not anymore. He reached for my hand. This time, I let him. Weeks passed. Daniel eventually called me. Not Robert, me. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, he said, but I didn't want silence to be the last thing between us. We talked for an hour, about nothing important and everything important. At the end, he said, you didn't owe me anything, but you treated me like a person. That mattered more than I expected. Robert never gave Daniel his kidney. Daniel found another donor months later. Robert aged in that waiting period, visibly. Guilt does that when it's no longer hidden. But something else happened too. He softened. He stopped managing outcomes. He started listening. As for me, I opened my own account. I booked a solo trip for the first time in my life. I told people no without explanation. I stopped confusing endurance with love. On a Tuesday morning not long ago, Robert reached for his jacket. "Bank run?" he said automatically. I looked at him. He froze. Then he slowly took the jacket off and sat back down. "It can wait," he said. I smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in 40 years, Tuesdays no longer belonged to a secret. My name is Linda Carver. I'm 67 years old. I didn't lose my marriage the day I learned the truth. I found myself, and this time I didn't freeze. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about all those Tuesdays I never questioned. I don't do it with bitterness anymore. I do it with clarity. I understand now that love without truth slowly turns into something hollow, something performative. I stayed because I believed loyalty meant silence. I learned too late that loyalty without honesty is just obedience dressed up as virtue. Robert still reaches for my hand sometimes, like he's checking if I'm real. I let him, not because I owe him reassurance, but because I choose when closeness is earned. That's the difference now. Choice. If someone reading this is sitting at their own kitchen table, wondering why a routine suddenly feels wrong, wondering why a simple question makes someone freeze, listen to that feeling. It isn't paranoia, it's wisdom arriving quietly. I wasted years believing stability was the same as safety. It isn't. Safety is knowing the truth and still standing. And now, finally, I do.